どうして昨日早く帰りましたか？ Why did you go home early yesterday? 用事がありましたから。Because I had plans. This kind of sounds broken Japanese, like it's pretty awkward. In this situation, we would normally use です and say どうして昨日早く帰ったんですか? Why did you go home early yesterday? You know, Minna, nihongo Volume 1 avoids です like it's playing red light, green light. The moment you use です, you get shot. But in real life, we use です very, very often. So it's important that you are exposed to this in the beginning. And as usual, I asked other native speakers to make sure that this is not just my opinion, and everybody said, yeah, this sounds pretty weird. And this is very context dependent because without どうして why, 昨日早く帰りましたか sounds fine in some situations. For example, you show up at work and your colleague is earlier than usual. And you don't know if he went home early yesterday or not because you usually leave earlier than him. And then you can use もしかして by any chance and say もしかして昨日早く帰りました? Did you go home early yesterday by any chance? And that's fine. But when you use どうして why, you already know that he went home early. In this kind of situation, you'd use です and say どうして昨日早く帰ったんですか? Why did you go home early yesterday? Because you're not nosy at all. But if you don't use です when we would, it can sound pretty awkward and broken, which doesn't help if you're navigating something like an office romance, which is already socially tricky. And です is a pretty difficult expression to master for learners, so it's very important that your examples use です the way we do, because the last thing you need is practicing how to use です incorrectly. Now the next sentence, 用事がありましたから because I had plans also sounds pretty weird because it's too formal in this kind of situation. And ですから and ますから are very commonly overused expressions in textbooks. And I said overused because yes, we do use them sometimes, but not the way that textbooks do. Like we do use it in some situations, like if you are a corrupt politician apologizing at the press conference. But if you're asking your colleague why he went home early, this is not a super formal situation. So in many cases, ありましたか sounds out of place. You can just say 用事があったんで I had plans using で which is a contraction of ので because. But this can sound a little curt or abrupt, so I'd say something like 用事があったんですよ I had plans using ですよ, which sounds a bit softer. So let me give you a more natural and practical dialogue. You come to the office and 有馬さん is early. 有馬さん、今日早いですね。有馬さん、you're early today. はい、昨日早く帰ったんで。Yeah, because I went home early yesterday. どうして早く帰ったんですか? Why did you go home early? ちょっと用事があったんですよ。Because I had something to take care of. And if you want to acquire natural and practical Japanese, maybe you can join my email group because I have both free and paid lessons where you can learn practical Japanese with natural and easy examples. So click on the link in the description or on the screen to subscribe to my email group, Japanese with Yuta.